When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night-starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. These lines were written by John Keats in January of 1818, and had his life been written by an author, supposing that it wasn't, we would say that these lines, along with many others that he wrote, were foreshadowing. With Keats' biography, we're at liberty to focus our attention on only a few years. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. I tell you this at the outset because it will inform a lot of our discussion around Keats. He was born in London in 1795. His father was an ostler, that's someone employed by an inn to watch the horses of the people staying there. Obviously, this type of job isn't necessarily familiar to many of us, but we can get some idea of its social standing. As a brief aside here, I do want to make a note, because I think in discussing these great writers, great figures of the past, and of this particular time and place, we often miss the nuances of class and status, because I think the way class existed in 18th, 19th century England is largely obscure to us unless we've studied the period in some detail. So, with, for example, Lord Byron, the clue is in the name. He was a member of the aristocracy, the elite of society, who came into a great sum of money as a part of his inheritance, and had access to the best kind of education. Then you have someone like Wordsworth, whose father owned land, and therefore would have been considered a gentleman. That's below aristocracy, but above the rest of common people who would have had to work in order to support themselves. This can also be confusing because we tend to use that word gentleman just to describe a kind or well-mannered person. This is because that is how gentlemen were expected to behave. If you were a gentleman or a member of gentry, you were expected to have better manners than common people. So there is a vestigial classism in that usage. So you have these categories: aristocracy, below that is gentry, and then below that everyone else who had to work a trade for a living. And this included even the trades that we might consider high status or financially dependable, like a doctor or a lawyer or even someone who owned a business. This would all be considered some form of tradesman. This is also why sometimes these people had more money than gentry. If the gentleman's land didn't come with a sizable income, then a tradesman might be able to make more money, per year, but that didn't necessarily confer the same status. So this was a time when money could come without status and status would come without money. Then as now, they more often than not went together, but there is a nuance there that I think is important. Before I get too lost in that, I'll move on. It's a very interesting subject if you want to learn more. But the point is, Keats comes from a background of people who had to work in order to sustain themselves, who had to work pretty regular jobs for the time. And this makes him different from some of the other great romantic figures. It means that he had to, or was at least expected to, work in some kind of trade or profession. He did apprentice in one for a while. And it also means he didn't have access to the kind of education that a Lord Byron had. This only makes what he was able to do with the English language all the more impressive. But it came with disadvantages as well, as it was something that conservative critics could use against him, as some very unkindly did. It might also have been a point of personal embarrassment, as we can see in his poem on Chapman's Homer, because he couldn't read Homer in the original Greek. In any case, after an apprenticeship as a doctor, which would have been a financially dependable profession as far as that went, even back then, he devoted himself completely to poetry, to the exclusion of any other profession. Then as now, this was not a financially sound decision, because he would still have to provide for himself. And he was followed by money problems for the rest of his fairly short life. Now, in that life, he published only 3 major works of poetry, 3 relatively slim volumes in 1816, 1818, and 1820. Or forgive me, I think the first was 1817. 1816 was the publication of his first standalone poem. Now, arguably the most significant of these publications, at least the most personally significant to Keats at this time, was Endymion, his 4,000-line poem based on the Greek myth about the shepherd of the same name, who was loved by the moon goddess. In Endymion, we get to see Keats' talents as a poet developing. Now, John Keats was a remarkable talent. Reportedly, many of his poems were written spontaneously, in only a single draft or with very little revision. According to one friend, the Ode to a Nightingale was composed almost absent-mindedly on a few loose scraps of paper that were almost lost behind some books, and that is remarkable. But despite this overflowing and spontaneous talent, Keats was exceptionally dedicated and hard-working at his craft. We see in an 1818 letter to John Taylor where he lays out a part of his poetic philosophy, and he thought quite a lot and quite closely about what being a poet meant and what poetry should be. We see in this letter that he even considered himself to be far from his own idea of a great poet. So he set challenges and tests for himself to grow and improve in his poetic skills. This was his reason for writing Endymion. He called it a test of invention. He meant to practice his ability to sustain a long narrative poem, setting a goal of 4,000 lines, which he eventually exceeded. He thought that by doing this he could train himself to equal what he thought of as the great poets. So with this in mind, Endymion is a flawed poem. Its meter trembles, its rhythm can be kind of breathless. It has lines that tumble over one another. So of the first 62 lines, 30 are enjambed, which I think gives an idea of what I mean by those preceding statements. Dr. Octavia Cox makes a good argument that this is actually by design and serves his aesthetic goals. I won't paraphrase her argument at length here, but I'll leave a link to her video somewhere that it can be seen. She has a great YouTube channel, some very good videos on Keats, some great videos on Jane Austen, so it's very much worth checking out. But she makes a pretty sound argument, in my opinion, as far as Keats' intentions with this poem, but it doesn't quite work for me. To me, Endymion reads more like it has a lack of control. The poem was intended as practice, and that's sort of what it feels like, practice for later work that would regrettably not come. And Endymion was met with pretty severe criticism on its publication in 1818. And some of Keats' contemporaries would attribute to this poor critical reception his ill health in following years. It is more likely that he had contracted his younger brother Thomas's tuberculosis, having spent a period of time nursing him until the latter's death in 1818. Incidentally, Keats had dedicated his Endymion to another Thomas, that was Thomas Chatterton, another poet who was famous in Keats' day mostly for having died young. He was a symbol of the romantic, tragic, and suffering ideal of an artist. Again, we might call this foreshadowing. When he coughed up blood in February of 1820, he was advised to travel to a warmer climate, but before he had committed himself to poetry, he had spent a long apprenticeship in medicine, receiving his apothecary license the same year he quit that profession. And he had also watched several family members, not only Thomas but also his mother and father, die of the same disease, tuberculosis. So this was enough to tell him that the end was probably pretty near. He remarked, just from the color of the blood that he had coughed, that it was, I believe, arterial. I'm not acquainted with the same medical vocabulary that Keats would have been with, but the point is, he understood that the prognosis wasn't very good. He was probably going to die. In his last months, though he couldn't bring himself to write his lover, Frances Fanny Braun, to whom he was never officially engaged for financial reasons, though they had for some time been in love, he revised a sonnet he had written her while aboard the ship that brought him to Italy. This was the sonnet, Bright Star. Bright star, were I as steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching, with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft-fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. This is an instance where knowledge of the poet's biography can enrich our reading of the poem, which is lovely on its own, but knowing that Keats knew he was about to die when he wrote it only increases its pathos. I'll speak more about the psychological dimensions of the poem in a few moments. After a period of suffering, and I think to us, tuberculosis, for most of us, will only be familiar from media, and we might be tempted to think of it only as a bad cough, right? If we haven't seen what it actually does. But his lungs were essentially disintegrating inside of his body. So I think that's enough to illustrate, but you get the idea. He was undergoing a period of intense suffering for a few months before he died on the 23rd of February, 1821, in Rome, where he was buried. His name at his request was not marked on his grave, which identifies him only as a young English poet. Now, the poem Bright Star. First, I want to just take it apart structurally. It's a sonnet that's 14 lines of iambic pentameter. It's in the Shakespearean style, so that's A-B, rhyming. It scans very well in iambic pentameter. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. But the lines are not contorted as in these traditional forms. Sometimes the language can be to fit that meter. It follows the rhythms and patterns of everyday speech, or, at least what was fairly close to everyday speech in Keats' time. Now, in the first 9 lines, we have all these images suggesting to us loneliness and also a kind of spirituality and impressions of death. not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's penitent, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite. An eremite is a hermit or someone in spiritual seclusion. There's a kind of spiritual sterility. I mean by that, we can see here the pure ablution of the waters around Earth's human shores. Ablution is a spiritual cleansing, but there's a distant quality to it, right? It's setting the speaker or the star apart from each other, or at least setting the star apart from human life. And I think that implies, if we're setting things apart from normal life, a different kind of life or a different condition. What I'm getting at here, for example, the new soft fallen mask of snow might suggest to us a funerary mask. I think that this set of images and this kind of language is creating a subtle but effective deathly kind of feeling, though not a morbid one, which is interesting. And then this is contrasted in the next sequence of lines from 10 to 14, where the speaker is pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast. Ripening means coming into life. To feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest. Unrest is turbulence or movement, but it's not an unpleasant movement, perhaps more like the moving waters from the earlier line at their priest-like task. This might suggest to us the movement of the waves or the sea. And still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever. There's a suggestion of immortality. I think all of this comes together to create an image of life in death, a kind of eternity. There is the unchangeable condition, like line 9, no, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable. To be unchangeable, of course, suggests a kind of state where life has passed from its normal condition of change, either to death or, again, some kind of eternity, some other kind of life. I think we have to keep in mind the spiritual context of Keats' time, which was predominantly Christian, even though he was not himself a devout Christian. This was the spiritual language that would have been familiar to him. Now, there's also an interesting tension in some of the language here. In a sonnet, traditionally, there is a significant turn of thought at some point in the poem, normally toward the latter half or last third of the poem. This is called a volta, where the poem jumps to another mode of thought. But here, it could be argued that the turn is in a few different places. When in line 1 he says, bright star, would I as steadfast as thou art. This is immediately followed, not in lone splendor. So, what exactly is being contradicted here? Not in lone splendor like the star? I am not like the star, says the speaker, or is the star not in lone splendor? Later, when he says no, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, again, is the speaker saying the star is not like this, is not in this sort of deathly, spiritually sterile condition like what he's been describing? Or is he saying that I'm not? Or is he saying, I don't want to be like that? Would I were steadfast as thou art? No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, but in a different way that he goes on to describe. I think the latter is probably the strongest reading. And then as we come further, to fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still. We have the repetition from earlier, no, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable. Here again, still, still. Of course, to still is to remain in place. But he wants to remain in a sweet unrest, a condition of movement. So the poem brings us back and forth between this stillness and this movement, like the movement of waters. And we can imagine Keats as he is on the ship bringing him to Italy, writing these lines and thinking about the motion of the waves. And it reads very much like a kind of last gasp of life, mixed with this sort of calm, not quite acceptance, but a recognition of death that is coming very soon. I think that's fair to say, again, with the context of how and when the poem was written in mind, but it's also there in the poem itself, in the structure of it. And so live ever, or else swoon to death. Here there's kind of a marriage of life and death. And I think here, reading this psychologically or psychoanalytically, we can see a kind of sublimation of the anxiety of death, where the speaker is transported away from the fear of death into this kind of rapturous feeling. We can see a similar anxiety and a similar act of sublimation, I think, in the poem I began this presentation with, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, which is a sonnet that was written in 1818. Here there is a contrast, not between stillness and movement, but between maturity and perhaps a different kind of movement, an impermanence or a transient quality. Before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and charactery, that means letters, hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. Here the speaker is anxious that he may cease to be, that he may die, before he has written all that he wants to write, or perhaps before he's learned how to write the way that he wants to. I think this is pretty autobiographical on Keats' part. It's sometimes dangerous to assume that the speaker is identical with the poet, but here I think that reading is sound. And when he thinks that he may never live to trace with the magic hand of chance, which is a lovely image, a little bit mysterious, obscure exactly what he means, but he will not live to trace with the magic hand of chance the huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. He won't get to put these lovely images, the things of his imagination or his experience, into verse. Perhaps just by the force of chance that may destroy him. Of course, Keats, having trained as a medical doctor and seen family members die of illness, and his younger brother Thomas died at the age of only 19, he was well aware of the fragility and the impermanence of life. And we see in this work, and in many places in his work, a sometimes prescient anxiety of death, especially of dying young. And here past line 8, when he feels fair creature of an hour, again, there's this idea of impermanence, that he won't look upon her more, never have, never relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love. I think unreflecting is an interesting word there. It can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. My first thought when reading it was that unreflecting perhaps meant unrequited, unreturned, i.e., the beloved does not reflect back to the lover, the lover's feeling. And this would be psychologically interesting, right? Because it implies a kind of thrill in unrequited affection. I think that would be ripe for some kind of analysis. However, I don't think it's quite on the right track. Instead, I think unreflecting more plainly here means without thought. And that works better in the context of the whole poem, because this entire poem is a thought, a rumination, and it ends with a thought. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Now here we might veer a little bit closer to deconstruction, because I think these last two lines are a little opaque, and I'm not sure if it's deliberate. There's a lingering question. Why do love and fame sink to nothingness? Now, love is what the poet has, or what the speaker in the poem has been alluding to in lines 9 to 12, addressing the fair creature of an hour. And fame seems to be what he's talking about in the first 8 lines, before where the volta would traditionally be placed. But why do they sink to nothing? What does that mean? There's a leap in thought here at the sort of second volta before the final couplet. I stand alone and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Does he think, and through his ruminations he stops caring about love and fame? That, I think, would be an unsatisfying reading, because we don't get to see his reasoning. And a sonnet is a particular form that's good at doing certain things, and a train of thought, exploring a particular train of thought, is one of them. Coleridge observed that the sonnet is a form in which some lonely feeling is developed, which I think is a lovely summation. And in the introduction to the Oxford Book of Sonnets, John Fuller adds that the sonnet, above all other lyric forms, with its unique combination of emotional intensity and argued development, gives the reader a powerful sense not only of a mind in communion with itself, but a mind in which thought significantly proceeds to a point of greater understanding. I think we have an impression of that here, but it's not a neat one. The understanding that the speaker has come to is not made entirely clear. Do love and fame sink to nothingness because the speaker understands that in ceasing to be, they will not exist anymore? Kind of a darker, more grim reading? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the poem really allows us to know. But what is clear, I think regardless, is that there is an anxiety of death, and of death cutting short a life full of potential. And once again, this is autobiographical on Keats' parts, presciently autobiographical, because he couldn't have known, and in 1818, though I think he was beginning to get sick, he didn't yet know he had tuberculosis. He died as his literary powers were still expanding, so it could be argued that almost none of his work really represents maturity as a poet. His talent is undeniable, and I think in his work and in his life he embodied the romantic ideal better than anyone. But to consider what kind of poetry he would have written had he lived longer, that is tragic to contemplate, and I think even more so reading it in light of this sort of prescient poem. Nevertheless, there is a kind of sublimation going on here. He is channeling the anxiety of death into his poetry, which in some way might dissipate the feeling. And we, in reading the poetry, might find our own catharsis, our own sublimated anxiety of death through the poem. Now, Keats, according to friends, was of a kind and affectionate disposition, but not overly emotional. He was even-tempered, self-critical, but not self-pitying, perhaps more analytical than passionate. Yet he wrote in an 1819 letter to Fanny Brawne, "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be a martyr for my religion. Love is my religion. I could die for that." So we see that he was certainly capable of deep emotion and of expressing it profoundly and passionately, which I think we see in both of these poems, especially Bright Star. And there is also some repeated imagery between both of the poems, the stars and the shore, which I think is interesting. The stars being this distant object that represents a kind of perfect spiritual sterility and perhaps a perfect dispassionate creativity, whereas the shore is the realm of mortality and human reflexivity. Standing on the shore, he thinks until love and fame to nothingness do sink. He thinks of death. I think that's significant. Anyway, I've gone on at some length, so why is Keats still read? First, I think we should ask, is he read? I don't know. Outside of a classroom, I'm not sure how many people are likely to encounter Keats, or how much Keats they're likely to encounter. But those who do read him, I suspect, are those who, being lovers of poetry, or being of a poetic disposition themselves, read him simply because the poems are beautiful. I think that's the most obvious reason. The poems are beautiful. That is the first reason to read poetry, and the first importance of poetry. Everything else comes after, in my mind. First, the poem is beautiful, then we can talk about its political dimensions. First, the poem is beautiful, and then we can deconstruct it as a linguistic artifact. I'm aware that this may not be considered an entirely academically sound position, so I'll leave that there, but that is my way of thinking. And Keats remains a poet's poet, really. Other poets, both his contemporaries and poets who came much later, addressed poems to him in recognition of this fact. Percy Shelley wrote Adonais not long after his death. Oscar Wilde wrote a sonnet on the auction of his letters. Dilrub Ahmed references Keats's poetic philosophy in her poem Phase I. That's a contemporary poet. Keats wrote Endymion as a test of his poetic craft, a test of invention. He dedicated himself to poetry, to training and improving his powers as a poet. And he dedicated himself to beauty, the romantic ideal, through his poetry. And when we read Keats, he brings us, I think, into his belief that beauty is not only the joy, but the purpose and the meaning of life. If we take him at his word that love was his religion, then beauty was the guiding star of that religion, and poetry was the language of its expression. As he begins Endymion with the line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." In other words, the beauty of life and the beauty of poetry will persist past death, and in this act of persistence, the poetic act as an act of sublimation, we might sublimate through Keats our own anxiety of death, our own feelings of worldly impermanence. Keats stretches us toward eternity. He helps us reach it through his poems. And this, incidentally, I think makes him in many ways what some other figures like Lord Byron sort of wished that they were. Because in Keats, and excuse me, I'll just make a note. I've spoken before about Lord Byron in our previous discussions. I like Lord Byron's work, so I'm not disparaging the work necessarily, but in Keats, we find a person who, in both his work and his life, I think, as well as in his death, embodies this romantic ideal. He suffered for his art, but not needlessly. Nor did he forget the suffering of others. By all accounts, he was kind and caring, and that, I think, is worthy of commemoration. So in that spirit, I would like to read an original piece, a sonnet addressed to Keats. I've tried to put these lines together over the past couple days. They could still use more work. Some of the imagery could be tightened up, I think, but such as they are, I will read them for you now. To Keats. Your name, that touches not your own mute grave, is graven not the less upon each heart, that, hearkening to the sweetly sounding clave of measured rhythms issued through your art, are made with you to journey by the stars, partakers of an ancient company, co-victors of its garland prize. The oars well timed by the song of your soul's errantry shall bring us by the track you speed us on, to find with you the prize of love in keeping, for beauty is our star, and love its dawn, not lessened by the pain of early reaping. We sail for love of beauty that is yours, your immortality, as love is ours.